Yes, and in an interesting way, what is the problem is also currently the same as the solution. I think the real reason why diversity is so bad or has been stuck at levels that are not really acceptable is simply because of the stability and longevity of people in the media business. For the first 60, 70 years of the news business, it was a business that was very stable and people would come in and never leave. So it was pretty common for somebody to come and work at a news organization for 20, 30 years. So a whole bunch of men mostly came in, and because they stayed, they rose through middle and senior ranks, while the number of women who started coming in is a more recent phenomenon. So as a result, the deck was stacked against women in particular in most traditional media companies. And as I said, that same thing has now become actually an advantage, because the instability and the lack of longevity in the media business means that there is a lot more turnover, and you're seeing the disruptive players, whether it's BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or Vice or Gizmodo Media, they all now have women in leadership roles because their history is not very long and it's not a very stable business. So there's a lot more turnover. I'll give you an example. In the last 10 years, there have been 4 top editors at the Wall Street Journal. The previous to that, Paul Steiger, served as managing editor for 16 years. So in that 16 years, it would have been very hard for a woman to even aspire to have that role. But in these last 10 years, the chances are a lot more, right? So I think that's what is changing, and that's why you are seeing the numbers starting to kind of climb a bit, because the industry is very volatile and the longevity is no longer guaranteed. So I actually think it's a positive. What was once a problem is now turning into a bit of a solution, I think. So they can be both positive and negative impacts, right? On the positive side, it compared us very favorably to a lot of our peer companies that were a lot larger and had a lot more resources. So there was a sense of pride in what we've already accomplished. So that was a good feeling to permeate across the news organization, because otherwise, anecdotally, there's always a sense that we are not really doing enough, or there are always problems. Journalists by nature are skeptical, so they tend to focus on the downside of everything. By putting out our numbers and showing that we had 21 women leaders out of 28 leaders in the company, and while there were ways to go in many areas, it gave a sense of that we are doing something right and different and better than a lot of our peer group. The downside of it is that it does put a lot of pressure on people to kind of question themselves and kind of feel a little bit, take the focus a little bit away from the journalism sometimes to kind of saying, why is my team kind of at the bottom of these rankings? But if you kind of construct the right reward systems, and I think those can also be turned into positives as well. And the biggest benefit, and in hindsight, I've said this to my team, practically every media organization in the US has had a Me Too issue in the last 2 years, right? Gizmodo Media Group was the only one, I think, that I know of that didn't have a single issue at all, right? We were writing about other people's issues. I think that stems from this culture of diversity and kind of promoting a lot of women and putting them in authority, and to kind of be able to kind of talk about that publicly, because the data was out there, and kind of point to maybe this is why our culture was different and better, was also a good reinforcing thing by those numbers being out in the public. Absolutely. I would argue that if you set your goal at 50-50 and stop there, you have not corrected for 100 years of 90-10, 80-20, 70-30, right? So I would think of 50-50 as just the baseline, and to try to skew it much more to kind of really correct historical gaps. And I would be happy if we get to 80-20 for a few years. And then if there is enough of a bubbling up of we are now losing that diversity, let it come up and let that be the impetus to kind of get the numbers back in order. You're right. I mean, having quotas is always a bit of a problematic way of managing these. But given the history of discrimination and lack of diversity, I think having aggressive quotas and kind of trying to go well above them ought to be the norm for the next couple of decades, because we really have to correct history. I mean, what the New York Times is doing, for example, with like the women obits they're writing, it'll take, if they do 100% of obits on women for the next X years, they will still not correct that, right? Wikipedia, where I'm on the board of the Wikimedia Foundation, 20% of the profiles on Wikipedia are women, right? So it'll take us a long time to get to parity, also because men's profiles continue to get added, right? So to settle at 20 or 25% would actually not be a disservice to women. I would say that we should set the goal, a minimum should be 50 and parity, and then it should be well above that.